December 10th, 1936, Windsor Castle. The king sits alone in a room where monarchs have made decisions for 900 years. Stone walls 3 feet thick, tapestries older than America. Outside, crowds gather in the cold, waiting for news that will reshape the British Empire. Edward VIII has been king for less than a year. Now he's about to become the only British monarch in history to voluntarily surrender the crown. Not because of war, not because of scandal in the usual sense, because he wants to marry an American woman, a divorced American woman. And the establishment parliament, the church, the aristocracy, the very stones of Windsor itself has made its position clear. The throne or the woman, not both. In a few hours he'll speak into a radio microphone and tell the world he's chosen love over duty. The speech will be heard by millions. It will sound romantic, noble even, but what the broadcast won't mention is everything that led here. The pressure, the manipulation, the quiet violence of a system designed to crush individual desire beneath the weight of tradition. Windsor Castle has stood for nearly 1,000 years. It has survived civil wars, revolutions, fires and bombings. It has housed tyrants and saints, warriors and scholars. But it has never bent. It does not bend for love. It does not bend for individuals. It bends for nothing. This is the story of how one of the world's oldest and most powerful fortresses became the stage for the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history. A crisis about duty and desire, tradition and modernity, public service and private happiness. A crisis that nearly ended the monarchy itself. This is the dark story of Windsor Castle and the abdication crisis of 1936. Windsor Castle sits on a chalk ridge above the River Thames, roughly 25 miles west of London. From a distance, it looks like something from a storybook. Round tower rising from the centre, stone walls stretching across 13 acres, flags catching the wind, beautiful. Aussie, permanent, but permanence is a performance. Windsor has burned, been rebuilt, been remodeled, been weaponized, been abandoned, and been resurrected more times than most nations have existed. It's not one building. It's 1,000 years of buildings layered on top of each other, each generation adding, changing, erasing what came before. William the Conqueror started it in 70, a timber fortress on the ridge to control the Thames approach to London. Stone replaced wood. Towers multiplied. Kings added halls, chapels, dungeons, gardens. By the 20th century, Windsor was the largest occupied castle in the world. A symbol, a statement. A weapon of soft power that announced, "We have been here forever, and we will be here forever." In December of 1936, that forever suddenly felt fragile. The new king, Edward VIII, had been on the throne for just 11 months. Charming, modern, unconventional. He'd spent years as Prince of Wales charming crowds and worrying the establishment. Now he was king. And he was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman in the process of divorcing her second husband. The Church of England, which the king headed, did not permit remarriage after divorce. The government opposed the match. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa made their objections clear. The choice was stark. Give up Wallis or give up the throne. Edward chose Wallis. The decision triggered a constitutional earthquake. Kings did not abdicate. Not in modern Britain. Not voluntarily. The monarchy was supposed to be bigger than any individual, a continuous thread linking past to future. Breaking that thread for personal desire felt to many like betrayal. To others, it felt like liberation proof that even kings were human, that love mattered more than duty. Both sides were right. Both sides were wrong. The truth, as always, was messier. What the tour guides at Windsor don't tell you is how this crisis nearly destroyed the institution the castle was built to protect. They don't talk about the emergency meetings held in those ancient rooms, the desperate calculations, the quiet threats. They don't mention how close the monarchy came to irrelevance. They show you the state apartments, the portraits, the ceremony. They don't show you the machinery beneath the power, the pressure, the human cost of keeping an ancient system alive in a modern world. This is that story, the one beneath the pageantry. The one about what happens when an immovable object, a 1,000-year-old castle, and the monarchy it represents meets an individual will that refuses to be crushed. This is the dark story of Windsor Castle and the Abdication crisis. Windsor Castle was never meant to be beautiful. William the Conqueror built it in 1070 for one purpose: control. The site was strategic, a chalk ridge commanding views of the Thames Valley, defensible from three sides, close enough to London to project power, but far enough to retreat if the city turned hostile. The first structure was timber, a motte and bailey fortress thrown up quickly by Norman soldiers who spoke French and governed a resentful Saxon population. Beauty was irrelevant. What mattered was the message: we are here, we are strong, and we are not leaving. The design was simple and brutal. A wooden tower sat atop an artificial mound, the motte surrounded by a protective enclosure, the bailey. Palisades ringed both. Ditches were dug deep. The location itself was the weapon. Stand on that ridge, and you could see anyone approaching for miles. Try to attack, and you'd be climbing open ground under arrow fire. William understood that conquest wasn't just about winning battles. It was about occupying minds. A fortress visible from every approach road told the English, resistance is futile. Within a generation, the timber aged and rotted. Norman rule, however, did not. Windsor remained essential. It guarded the western approaches to London. It controlled river traffic on the Thames. Kings used it as a base during hunting expeditions in the royal forests that stretched for miles around. But timber fortresses have limits. They burn, they decay. They lack the psychological weight of stone. By the time Henry I died in 135, Windsor was already being rebuilt in stone. The process would continue for centuries. Each king added, reinforced, expanded. Stone walls replaced wooden palisades. The round tower began its climb skyward from the central mound. Quarters for the garrison were built into the walls. Chapels appeared, storerooms, armories. What began as a temporary garrison became a permanent seat of power. The architecture spoke clearly. High walls said, "You cannot enter without permission." Narrow windows said, "We can see out, you cannot see in." Thick doors, iron-bound and heavy, said, "This place does not yield." And the location, always the location, sitting above the valley, said, "We are watching, always." The Norman kings who built Windsor understood something essential about power. It's not enough to have strength. You must display it. You must make people feel it in their bones. A castle isn't just fortification. It's theater. It's a stone sermon on the permanence of authority. Stand at the gates and look up. The walls climb. The towers loom. The message is unmistakable. This has been here longer than you, and it will be here long after you're gone. Submit. That message, carved into limestone and mortar, would endure for 900 years. Through civil wars and revolutions, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional rule, Windsor would remain. Henry II replaced William's timber with stone in the 1170s. Massive walls, 12 feet thick in places, rose around the central mound. The round tower climbed skyward, a statement visible for miles. Each generation added layers. Edward III in the 1300s built Sant, George's Hall, for his new Order of the Garter, a chivalric brotherhood designed to bind nobles to the crown through ritual and honor. Henry VIII fortified the castle with artillery bastions. Elizabeth I, during plague years. By the time the English Civil War erupted in the 1640s, Windsor was already ancient, already layered with history, already a symbol too powerful to destroy even when Parliament held it and the monarchy collapsed. Henry II rebuilding was methodical. He understood that a fortress needed to do more than repel attackers. It needed to project legitimacy. His stone walls were precision work. Masons cut each block to fit tightly with minimal mortar. The craftsmanship declared, "This is not temporary. This is not expedient. This is built to last centuries." The investment was staggering. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Skilled labor was expensive. The project consumed years of royal revenue. But Henry wasn't building for himself alone. He was building for the idea of kingship itself. Edward III took Windsor further. By the mid-1300s, England was at war with France. Edward needed to rally his nobles, to create bonds of loyalty that went beyond feudal obligation. He founded the Order of the Garter, a chivalric order modeled on Arthurian legend, with Windsor as its spiritual home. St. George's Hall became the order's ceremonial space. Knights gathered there in elaborate robes. Rituals were performed. Oaths were sworn. The pageantry served a purpose. It tied the nobility's honor and identity to the crown and to Windsor itself. The hall was vast, carved hammerbeam roof, windows filled with heraldic glass, fireplaces large enough to roast whole animals. When the knights assembled, surrounded by banners bearing their coats of arms, the message was unmistakable. You are part of something ancient and glorious. Your loyalty is to this tradition, embodied in this place. Henry VIII, obsessed with security after breaking with Rome, turned Windsor into a fortress again. He added artillery bastions designed to mount cannon. The medieval walls, built for arrows and siege towers, were reinforced for a new age of warfare. Gunpowder had changed the rules. Walls had to be thicker, angles calculated to deflect cannon shot. Henry spent lavishly. Windsor, already formidable, became nearly impregnable. Elizabeth I used Windsor differently. London was crowded, disease-ridden, politically volatile. Windsor offered escape. When plague struck the capital, Elizabeth retreated to the castle. The air was cleaner, the household smaller and easier to control. She could govern from Windsor, receiving ambassadors and ministers while maintaining distance from the mob. The castle's role expanded, not just fortress, not just ceremonial stage, refuge. Then came the Civil War. In 1642, England tore itself apart, king against parliament, royalist against Roundhead. Windsor fell to parliamentary forces early in the conflict. For nearly a decade it served as a prison. When the war ended and Charles I was executed in 1649, the monarchy itself seemed finished. Windsor stood empty, but the stones were too massive to demolish. So Windsor waited, silent and watching, until the restoration came in 1660. By Queen Victoria's reign in the 19th century, Windsor had become something more than a fortress. It was the emotional and ceremonial heart of the British monarchy. Victoria loved Windsor. She married Prince Albert in the castle's chapel. She mourned him there after his death in 1861, retreating to Windsor and barely leaving for years. The castle absorbed her grief and became synonymous with royal duty, sacrifice, and endurance. State funerals were held there. Coronations were planned there. Foreign leaders visited and were awed by the ancient halls, the paintings, the sense of unbroken continuity. Windsor wasn't just where kings lived. It was where the monarchy meant something. Victoria's transformation of Windsor was profound. When she married Albert in 1840, the ceremony took place in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace in London, but Windsor became their true home. Albert, German-born and intellectually ambitious, saw Windsor as a blank canvas. He pushed for renovations. Private apartments were modernized, running water, better heating, gas lighting. The medieval gloom was softened. Family life, previously invisible, became central to Victoria's public image. When Albert died of typhoid in December 1861, Victoria's grief was overwhelming. She withdrew to Windsor and barely left for 3 years. The castle became her sanctuary and prison. She wore black for the rest of her life. Albert's rooms were kept exactly as he left them. Fresh clothes were laid out daily. Water was brought for washing. The rituals of mourning became rituals of presence. Albert's ghost inhabited Windsor as much as Victoria herself. The public grew restless. The Queen was invisible. Republicans gained ground, arguing the monarchy was obsolete. But Victoria would not budge. Windsor held her. Eventually, her ministers coaxed her back into limited public duties. But Windsor remained her emotional center. She died there in 1901, surrounded by children and grandchildren, in the same castle where she had mourned Albert for 40 years. Victoria's long association with Windsor embedded the castle in the national imagination. It was no longer just a royal residence. It was the royal residence, the place where the monarch truly lived. Buckingham Palace was for business. Windsor was for meaning. The 20th century amplified this. Edward VII, Victoria's son, preferred Sandringham and Balmoral, but Windsor's ceremonial role grew. George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936, understood the power of symbolism. He held investitures at Windsor. Foreign dignitaries were received in the state apartment's vast rooms decorated with old master paintings and priceless furniture, designed to overwhelm visitors with the depth and continuity of British monarchy. St. George's Chapel became the burial place for modern monarchs. Edward VII was buried there. George V would be. The chapel, already ancient, gained additional weight. Attending a service there meant standing in a space where kings had worshipped for 600 years. The architecture itself, the vaulted ceiling, the banners of the Knights of the Garter hanging above the stalls, the tombs of medieval kings beneath the floor, was a sermon on permanence and continuity. By 1936, Windsor had accumulated nearly 900 years of symbolic weight. It was an argument made in stone. Monarchy is permanent, duty is absolute, individuals serve the institution. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known as David, to his family was born in 1894. The eldest son of the future King George V. From birth, he was the heir. His life was planned: education, military service, royal tours, then the throne. But Edward chafed against every expectation. He hated the rigidity, the formality, the endless ceremonies that felt hollow. As Prince of Wales, he charmed crowds with his informality and modern style. He visited factories and slums, spoke to working people, and seemed genuinely interested in their lives. The public loved him. The establishment worried. He was too casual, too independent, too willing to question tradition. And worst of all, he fell in love with the wrong woman. Edward's childhood was cold. His father, George V, was a stern disciplinarian who believed princes needed to be toughened through discipline and distance. Affection was sparse. Criticism was constant. Edward's tutors found him charming but unfocused. He disliked academic work and struggled with attention. What he excelled at was people. He had charisma, an easy smile, and a knack for making others feel seen. When World War I began in 1914, Edward was 20. He wanted to fight. The War Office refused. Losing the air in combat was unthinkable. He was given a staff position in France, safely behind the lines. He hated it. He visited troops, toured hospitals, and saw enough of the war's horror to be marked by it. Millions of young men his age were dying in trenches. He wore a uniform but was forbidden from sharing their danger. The hypocrisy stung. After the war, Edward became Prince of Wales officially and began royal tours. He traveled to Canada, Australia, India, South America. Everywhere he went, crowds mobbed him. He broke protocol, constantly shaking hands enthusiastically, posing for photographs, speaking informally. His handlers were appalled. The public was delighted. Here was a prince who seemed human, modern, relatable. But Edward was also lonely. His personal life was a series of affairs, mostly with married women. The relationships followed a pattern: intense, brief, ultimately unsatisfying. He seemed to be searching for something: connection, meaning, escape, but never quite finding it. His father disapproved of his lifestyle. His mother worried. His siblings, particularly his younger brother Bertie, the future George Fici, watched with a mix of sympathy and exasperation. By the early 1930s, Edward was approaching 40. He had been Prince of Wales for nearly 2 decades. The role felt like a cage. The ceremonies, the tours, the relentless public scrutiny, all of it exhausted him. He told friends he wasn't sure he wanted to be king. The throne represented everything he'd come to resent: duty without joy, tradition without meaning, a life entirely not his own. Then he met Wallis Simpson. The introduction came in 1931 at a house party. Wallis was sharp-witted, confident, and utterly unlike the debutantes and aristocrats Edward usually encountered. She was American, which meant she didn't automatically defer to royalty. She was older, born in 1896, 2 years after Edward. She was married. None of this mattered to Edward. He was captivated. The relationship began slowly but intensified quickly. By 1934, it was clear Edward was in love. To him, Wallis was everything. To the establishment, she was disaster. Wallis Warfield Spencer Simpson was born in Baltimore in 1896 into a respectable but not wealthy family. She married young, divorced, remarried, and by the early 1930s was living in London society, charming and ambitious. She met Edward in 1931. He was smitten almost immediately. To him, Wallis was sophisticated, witty, and refreshingly direct, everything the stuffy British aristocracy was not. To the establishment, she was disaster. American, twice divorced, sharp-tongued, and utterly unsuitable for a future queen. The relationship became an open secret by 1934. By 1936, when Edward's father, King George IV, died and Edward ascended the throne, the crisis was inevitable. Wallis's early life was defined by social ambition and financial insecurity. Her father died when she was young. Her mother struggled. Wallis learned early that charm and wit could open doors money couldn't. Her first marriage to a U.S. Navy pilot named Earl Winfield Spencer ended in divorce after years of unhappiness and his alcoholism. Her second marriage to Ernest Simpson in 1928 was more stable but passionless. Ernest was comfortable, well-connected, and dull. Wallis wanted more. London society in the early 1930s was a small, interconnected world. Wallis, through Ernest's business connections, gained entry. She cultivated friendships with influential hostesses. She dressed impeccably. She mastered the art of conversation, gossipy enough to be entertaining, discreet enough to be trusted. She was noticed. And when she met the Prince of Wales, she understood immediately what was happening. Edward pursued her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He telephoned constantly. He sent notes. He arranged for her and Ernest to be invited to royal events. By 1934, the three of them, Edward, Wallis, and Ernest, were spending weekends together at Fort Belvedere, Edward's private residence near Windsor. The arrangement was bizarre and unsustainable. Ernest played the role of the accommodating husband. Wallis played the charming companion. Edward played the lovesick prince. London society whispered. The American press, less constrained by deference to royalty, began printing rumors. British newspapers, bound by a gentleman's agreement, stayed silent, but everyone who mattered knew. George V knew. In his final months, weakened by illness, he reportedly told his private secretary, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within a year." The boy was Edward. The prediction was accurate. George V died on January 20, 1936. Edward became king. He was 41 years old. For most of his life, he'd been the heir, always waiting, always in training, never quite in control. Now he was king, and he intended to marry Wallis Simpson. The problems were immediate and insurmountable. Wallis was still married to Ernest. Divorce proceedings would take months. Even after the divorce, she would be a divorced woman. The Church of England, which the king headed as supreme governor, did not permit remarriage after divorce. The Church's position was clear. Marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble except by death. This wasn't just theology. It was constitutional. The king was the Church's head. If he married a divorced woman, he would be defying the Church's own doctrine. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin laid out the facts. The government cannot support this marriage. The Church cannot support it. The Dominions oppose it, Edward argued. He believed public opinion would save him. He was wrong. The British Constitution is unwritten, which means it depends on precedent, custom, and negotiation. When Edward made clear he intended to marry Wallis, the machinery of state moved with quiet brutality. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin met with the king repeatedly, presenting the case. The Church of England forbids remarriage after divorce. As supreme governor of the Church, the king cannot marry a divorced woman. The Dominion governments, Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, were consulted. All opposed the marriage. Baldwin told Edward plainly, If you insist on marrying Mrs. Simpson, the government will resign. A constitutional crisis will follow. The monarchy itself may not survive. The message was clear: your personal happiness does not matter. The institution is bigger than you. Baldwin was methodical. He understood that Edward, for all his charm and public popularity, was politically isolated. The king had no party, no power base, no constitutional authority to act independently. The monarchy's power had been eroding for centuries. By 1936, the king reigned but did not rule. Parliament held the real power. The king's role was symbolic to embody continuity, stability, and national unity. A king who defied his government wasn't exercising power. He was committing political suicide. Baldwin's strategy was patience. He let Edward exhaust himself. Every meeting followed the same pattern. Edward would argue, "I love Wallis. I cannot live without her. The people will support me." Baldwin would respond, "The Constitution does not permit this. The Church does not permit this. The Dominions do not permit this. You must choose." The Dominions' opposition was crucial. In 1936, the British Empire was transitioning into the Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand were self-governing but still recognized the British monarch as their head of state. Any change to the monarchy required their consent. Baldwin consulted each Dominion government through official channels. The responses were unanimous. No. A twice-divorced American queen was unacceptable. Australia's Prime Minister was blunt. If Edward marries Mrs. Simpson, Australia will seriously consider becoming a republic. Canada's government agreed. South Africa, already uneasy about ties to Britain, signaled the same. The message to Baldwin was clear: push this, and you'll fracture the empire. Baldwin delivered that message to Edward. Your personal choice could destroy the Commonwealth. Is that a price you're willing to pay? Edward, in his isolation, believed public opinion would save him. He had always been popular. Crowds adored him. Surely, if he appealed directly to the people, they would support him against the politicians and bishops. He was wrong. The public was divided. Some sympathized love should matter, even for a king. Others were horrified duty comes first. Personal desire is secondary. The newspapers, once the gentleman's agreement broke down in early December, split along predictable lines. Conservative papers condemned Edward's selfishness. Liberal papers were more sympathetic but acknowledged the constitutional impossibility. The Church's position was immovable. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, met with Edward and made the Church's stance clear. Remarriage after divorce is forbidden. If you marry Mrs. Simpson, you cannot remain supreme governor of the Church. The coronation service would be impossible. Edward argued that the Church's rules were outdated. Lang did not budge. Doctrine is doctrine. You can change the law, but you cannot change the Church's teaching. Not quickly. Not for one man. Behind closed doors, the pressure intensified. Edward's family was brought in. His mother, Queen Mary, made her disapproval clear. His brother Bertie was appalled. By late November, Edward was cornered. Baldwin had outmaneuvered him. The machinery of state had closed every exit. On December 5th, Edward chose abdication. November 1936. Edward is at Windsor, pacing the same halls where his father died, where Victoria mourned Albert, where centuries of monarchs made decisions they could not escape. Advisors come and go. Letters arrive from ministers, bishops, family members, all saying the same thing: this cannot happen. Wallis is in the south of France, hounded by reporters. Edward barely sleeps. He smokes constantly. Staff whisper in corridors. The household senses something breaking. Outside, crowds gather at the gates, unsure whether to support their king or condemn his selfishness. The press, bound by a gentleman's agreement, has stayed mostly silent. But American newspapers are running the story. The secret is cracking open. Windsor in those weeks felt like a siege. Edward moved between Fort Belvedere, his private residence, and Windsor Castle, unable to settle. At Windsor, the weight of history was oppressive. Portraits of his ancestors lined the walls. Kings who had sacrificed, endured, and ruled. Their eyes seemed to follow him. He told friends he felt judged by the dead. The household staff, accustomed to routine and order, found themselves in uncharted territory. Normally, the king's schedule was planned weeks in advance. Now, it shifted hourly. Meals were irregular. Meetings happened at odd hours. Servants didn't know what was expected. The atmosphere was tense. Footmen exchanged glances. Maids whispered in the kitchens. Everyone knew something was breaking, but no one spoke openly. Edward's private secretary, Alec Hardinge, tried to manage the crisis. Hardinge was a career civil servant, loyal to the institution of monarchy more than to any individual king. He drafted letters, coordinated meetings, and attempted to impose order on chaos. But Edward was increasingly unreachable. He spent hours on the telephone with Wallis in France. He ignored official correspondence. He refused to engage with the constitutional arguments Baldwin kept presenting. The pressure showed physically. Edward, normally trim and energetic, looked haggard. He smoked constantly, sometimes 2 packs a day. He drank more than usual. Friends who saw him in those weeks reported that he seemed distracted, almost dissociated, as if he were already somewhere else. Wallis, in France, was under her own siege. Reporters surrounded the villa where she was staying. Photographers with long lenses camped in the hills. Every movement was documented. Letters arrived daily, many vicious. She was called every imaginable name. The hatred was visceral. She told Edward by telephone that she was frightened. Edward reassured her, but the reassurance rang hollow. Inside Windsor, the machinery of abdication was already being prepared. Legal advisors were consulted. The instrument of abdication was being drafted. The family's reaction added another layer of pain. Queen Mary was horrified. She met with Edward at Windsor and reportedly told him, "You are putting your desires above the crown, above everything." She left in tears. Edward's brother Bertie was pulled into crisis meetings he never wanted. If Edward abdicated, the throne would pass to him. He was terrified. His wife Elizabeth was furious at Edward. The relationship between the brothers fractured. Outside Windsor's gates, crowds gathered. Some held signs supporting the king. Others condemned him. Britain was splitting over a question with no good answer. Should a king choose personal happiness over duty? The press finally broke on December 3rd. The secret was out. For 10 days, Britain talked about little else. Edward, inside Windsor, felt the walls closing. December 10th, 1936. Edward signs the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere, his private residence near Windsor. The throne passes immediately to his younger brother, who will reign as George V. That evening, Edward returns to Windsor Castle one final time to record a radio address. He sits in a room overlooking the Thames. Engineers set up the microphone. At 10 o'clock he speaks, "You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The words are calm. The tone is steady. Millions listen. Some weep. Some rage. The monarchy survives, barely. The broadcast was arranged quickly. The BBC set up equipment in a room at Windsor Castle. Edward arrived in the evening, accompanied by his brother, now King George V. The 2 men barely spoke. The relationship, once warm, was strained beyond repair. George V's face was tight with stress. He would be king in a matter of hours, unprepared and unwilling, because his brother had chosen love over duty. Edward sat before the microphone. He had written the speech himself, with some editing from Winston Churchill, who had provided rhetorical polish. The words were carefully chosen to frame the abdication as noble sacrifice rather than dereliction. At 10:00 p.m., the broadcast began. Across Britain and the Empire, families gathered around radios. In homes, pubs, and public halls, people listened in silence. Edward's voice came through clearly. "At long last I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak." He continued, "A few hours ago I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne, But I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The phrasing was masterful. Edward presented himself as the victim of impossible circumstance, forced to choose between love and duty. He claimed, "This was a thing I had to judge entirely for myself. The other person most nearly concerned has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course." Whether this was true is debatable. Wallis later wrote that she had urged Edward to reconsider, but other accounts suggest she was more ambivalent. Edward closed, "And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king." The broadcast ended. Silence followed, then the national anthem. Across the country, reactions split. Some listeners wept. The romantic narrative was powerful. Others were furious. A king abandoning duty felt like betrayal. Edward left Windsor that night. He boarded a ship and sailed for France. He would not return to Britain for years. The man who had been king for less than a year became the Duke of Windsor. He married Wallis in France in June 1937. The wedding was small and attended by none of his family. Windsor Castle prepared for a new king. George V and his family moved in. The transition was swift. Edward's belongings were packed. The household staff adjusted. The machinery of monarchy continued without pause. But the abdication left scars. The monarchy survived, but its myth of permanence had been shattered. Edward sailed into exile the next day. He married Wallis in France in 1937. They lived abroad for the rest of their lives, mostly in Paris, never fully welcomed back. George V, shy and stammering, became king with his wife Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, beside him. They moved into Buckingham Palace but spent weekends at Windsor. George V worked to repair the damage, presenting himself as dutiful, stable, and devoted to service. During World War II, he and Elizabeth refused to leave London during the Blitz, a decision that restored public faith in the monarchy. Windsor became again what it had always been, a symbol of continuity, endurance, and duty above self. George V's first months as king were agonizing. He had never expected or wanted the throne. His stammer, a lifelong struggle, made public speaking torture. His first Christmas broadcast was an ordeal. George V sat before the microphone, Elizabeth beside him for moral support, and forced the words out. The pauses were long. The effort was visible. But the British public heard something different from Edward's smooth eloquence. They heard a man struggling to do his duty despite his limitations. It was humanizing. Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, became George V.'s anchor. She was strong, charming, and politically savvy. She understood public relations instinctively. Together, they rebuilt the monarchy's image, not as glamorous or modern, but as solid, dependable, and utterly committed to service. Windsor Castle became central to that image. George V and Elizabeth spent weekends there with their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. They were photographed walking the grounds, attending chapel, hosting small gatherings. The message was clear. We are a family. We are normal. We are here to serve. World War II tested that message. When war broke out in September 1939, many urged the royal family to leave London, to move to Canada for safety. George V.I. and Elizabeth refused. They would stay in Britain, share the danger, and stand with their people. It was a calculated risk, but it worked. During the Blitz, when German bombers pounded London nightly, George V.J. and Elizabeth remained at Buckingham Palace. The palace was hit multiple times. Windows shattered, walls cracked. The king and queen continued their routine, visiting bombed neighborhoods and meeting families who had lost homes. Elizabeth reportedly said, after Buckingham Palace was bombed, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Windsor Castle became a refuge for the princesses during the war. Elizabeth and Margaret were moved there for safety. They spent most of the war at Windsor, attending lessons and growing up in the shadow of conflict. The castle, once associated with Edward's abdication crisis, now symbolized stability amid chaos. George V's health suffered under the strain. He smoked heavily, a habit that would eventually kill him. But through the war years, he was a visible, constant presence. He visited troops, toured factories, and awarded medals. The war ended in 1945. Britain was exhausted and broke. The monarchy could have seemed irrelevant. Instead, it emerged with renewed legitimacy. George VI and Elizabeth had proven their value. They had stayed. They had served. George V died in February 1952. His daughter Elizabeth succeeded him as Elizabeth II. She was 25 but already trained in duty. She had watched her father struggle and endure. She understood the lesson. The monarchy survives by putting the institution first. Windsor remained the monarchy's heart throughout her 70-year reign. Walk through Windsor today and the architecture tells the story. State apartments designed to impress foreign dignitaries with scale and grandeur. Private quarters tucked away, modest by comparison. Servants' passages hidden in the walls, allowing staff to move unseen. Guard posts, gates, walls every element, designed to control access, maintain hierarchy, and project power. The castle is not a home in any normal sense. It's a machine for producing monarchy, for staging the rituals and ceremonies that keep the institution alive. Edward's abdication was a failure of that machine. He refused to perform the role. The system ejected him. Windsor's layout encodes hierarchy into stone. The state apartments occupy the North Range, overlooking the Thames. These rooms, the grand reception room, the throne room, St. George's Hall, are vast, ornate, and designed for display. Ceilings soar, chandeliers glitter. Gilt frames hold portraits of monarchs stretching back centuries. Every surface announces, this is power, this is history, this is permanence. Foreign dignitaries entering these rooms are meant to feel small. The scale overwhelms, the history intimidates. You are not meeting a person. You are meeting an institution that has endured 1,000 years and will endure 1,000 more. The private apartments, by contrast, are relatively modest. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, simpler furnishings. This is where the royal family actually lives during Windsor weekends. The contrast is deliberate. Public grandeur, private normalcy. The architecture enforces the distinction. You are either on stage or off. There is no in-between. Servants' passages thread through the walls like a hidden circulatory system. These narrow corridors allow staff to move between floors and wings without appearing in the principal spaces. A fire needs stoking. A servant uses the hidden stair, tends the fire, and disappears before the family or guests notice. Meals are prepared in basement kitchens and carried up through service passages. The system ensures that labor remains invisible. This invisibility is essential to the monarchy's operation. The illusion is that the institution functions effortlessly. The reality is dozens of staff working in shifts to maintain that illusion. The architecture hides them, ensuring the magic is never broken. Guard posts and gates control access at every level. The main gate, the Henry VIII gate, is massive and ceremonial, but the real security is deeper. Inner gates, checkpoints, locked doors, surveillance. The castle is layered like an onion. Each layer restricts access further. By the time you reach the private apartments, you've passed through multiple checkpoints. The message is clear. This space is controlled. You are here because we allow it. St. George's Chapel, where monarchs are buried and knights of the Garter are inducted, is both a masterpiece of Gothic architecture and a stage. The pews, the banners hanging above the stalls, the procession routes, all are designed to reinforce hierarchy. The monarch sits above everyone. The knights sit in order of seniority. The architecture choreographs behavior, ensuring everyone knows their place. Edward's abdication was, in architectural terms, a failure of containment. The system couldn't force him to stay in his assigned role. The walls, the ceremonies, the weight of history, all designed to make individual rebellion impossible, failed. Edward slipped out. The monarchy's response was to tighten the system. Future heirs would be trained more intensively. Elizabeth II absorbed this completely. She would reign for 70 years, never once deviating. Windsor's architecture supported that reign. The castle provided the stage. The ceremonies provided the script, and the institution continued. Edward and Wallis lived together for 35 years. By most accounts, the marriage was complicated. Wallis was often cold. Edward was often lost, a man without purpose, exiled from the only role he'd ever been trained for. They traveled, hosted parties, appeared in society pages. But they were ghosts, famous but irrelevant. In 1972, Edward died in Paris. Wallis lived another 14 years, increasingly isolated and unwell. The question that haunted them both, was it worth it? Edward always insisted yes. Wallis, in private moments, reportedly wondered. The romance that broke a king ended in a Paris apartment, far from Windsor, far from power. After the abdication, Edward and Wallis settled in France. They lived in a grand house in the Bois de Boulogne, provided rent-free by the French government. It was luxurious high ceilings, antique furniture, staff, but it was also a gilded cage. Edward had no job, no official role, no purpose. For a man who had spent his life in service, even reluctant service, the idleness was corrosive. He tried to find meaning. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1951. The book was polished, well-reviewed, and defensive. Edward presented himself as the victim of an inflexible system. Critics argued he was rewriting history. Wallis adapted better initially. She enjoyed the social life, dinners, parties, travel. Parisian society welcomed her, but she was also aware of the whispers. She was the woman who had brought down a king. Some admired her, others despised her. The marriage itself was complex. Friends reported that Wallis could be cold, even cruel. She mocked Edward's idleness. She reminded him in moments of anger that he had given up a throne for her. Edward seemed lost. He had defined himself by his role. Without it, he didn't know who he was. They had no children. That absence deepened the sense of futility. There was no next generation, no legacy beyond the scandal. Edward's brother George Fii had daughters. Elizabeth II had children. The monarchy continued without Edward. He was erased through irrelevance. World War II complicated their exile. Edward briefly served as governor of the Bahamas, a minor post far from Europe. The appointment was politically motivated to keep Edward away from Europe, where his Nazi sympathies could cause problems. He and Wallis hated the posting and returned to France after the war. The question of Nazi sympathies haunted Edward. In the 1930s, he had expressed admiration for Hitler's Germany. After the abdication, he and Wallis visited Germany in 1937, met Hitler, and were photographed giving Nazi salutes. The images are damning. Edward later claimed naivety, but the photographs remained. By the 1950s, Edward and Wallis were aging. The parties grew smaller. The travel slowed. Edward's health declined. He smoked heavily and drank regularly. Wallis became increasingly difficult, demanding, sharp-tongued, bitter. In 1972, Edward was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. He died on May 28 in Paris, with Wallis beside him. His body was flown to Britain and buried at Windsor. The funeral was attended by the royal family, but stiffly. Edward had been gone for 36 years. Wallis lived another 14 years. She became reclusive, suffering from dementia and physical decline. She was cared for by staff, rarely left the house, and seemed trapped in memories. She died in 1986 and was buried beside Edward at Windsor. The question remains, was it worth it? Edward always claimed yes, insisting love mattered more than duty, but his life after abdication suggests otherwise. He was adrift, purposeless. Wallis's answer is harder to discern. Friends reported she sometimes regretted the abdication not because she loved Edward less, but because the cost was higher than anticipated. The abdication is often romanticized, but the reality was messier. Two people escaped one constraint and entered another. They never escaped the abdication itself. The abdication crisis was a turning point. It taught the monarchy that survival required flexibility within rigid boundaries. The institution had to appear modern, relatable, human while maintaining the ancient structures that gave it legitimacy. George Vice, And Elizabeth, and later Elizabeth II, mastered this balance. They performed duty flawlessly while allowing carefully controlled glimpses of humanity. Windsor remained the symbol, but the monarchy learned that symbols must adapt or die. Edward's abdication became a cautionary tale told to every heir. The crown is not yours. You are its temporary servant. If you cannot serve, you will be replaced. The immediate aftermath of the abdication was chaos. George VI was thrust onto the throne unprepared. The monarchy's image was damaged, public confidence was shaken. But the institution survived, and it learned the first lesson: duty is absolute. The monarchy cannot afford another Edward. Future heirs would be trained from birth to understand that their lives were not their own. Elizabeth II, who became heir apparent when her father took the throne, absorbed this completely. Her entire reign, 70 years, was defined by unwavering duty. She never deviated. She never complained publicly. She was the role. The second lesson: control the narrative. Edward had been allowed too much freedom as Prince of Wales. He travelled independently, gave interviews, expressed opinions. The new model was tighter. Royal family members would have handlers, press secretaries, carefully managed public appearances. Every word, every gesture, every photograph would be controlled. The third lesson: modernize without losing mystique. The monarchy had to evolve. Post-war Britain was democratic, egalitarian, skeptical of inherited privilege. The monarchy couldn't survive as an untouchable divine institution. It had to be relatable, but it couldn't be too relatable. The magic had to be preserved. George VI and Elizabeth navigated this carefully. They allowed limited access. They gave interviews but stayed on message. They appeared in newsreels and television, but always in controlled settings. The balance worked. By the time George VT died in 1952, the monarchy had regained its footing. Elizabeth II refined the model. Her coronation in 1953 was televised, a radical decision that brought millions into Westminster Abbey. But the cameras were positioned carefully. They showed grandeur, ceremony, continuity, not backstage chaos or human frailty. Elizabeth II became the ultimate rebuke to Edward's abdication. Where Edward chose personal happiness, Elizabeth chose duty. Where Edward chafed against constraint, Elizabeth embraced it. Her reign was long, stable, and almost devoid of scandal. She became the embodiment of the institution. Windsor Castle remained central to this project. Elizabeth II spent weekends there throughout her reign. She died there in September 2022. The castle had witnessed the abdication crisis and became the stage for her final act. The continuity was deliberate. Windsor had outlasted Edward. It would outlast Elizabeth II. The institution endured. The abdication also changed how the royal family managed personal relationships. Marriage became a matter of state interest. Elizabeth II's sister Margaret wanted to marry a divorced man in the 1950s. The government and church opposed it. Margaret chose duty over love. Charles, Elizabeth II's son, faced similar pressures. He married Diana Spencer in 1981. The marriage was miserable. Charles loved Camilla Parker Bowles, a divorced woman. He stayed in the marriage for years. When he and Diana divorced, the damage was severe. But Charles eventually married Camilla in 2005, after public attitudes had shifted. The abdication crisis taught the monarchy it could bend, but only slowly. Edward had tried to force change overnight. The system rejected him. Modern royalty operates within this framework. They have more freedom than Edward, but it's freedom on a leash. Windsor Castle stands as the embodiment of this system. The walls are old, the rituals are ancient, but the institution adapts quietly. The castle has electric lights, modern plumbing, Wi-Fi, but the structure remains medieval. The balance between continuity and change is the monarchy's survival strategy. Edward's abdication is remembered as romantic tragedy, but for the monarchy it was a lesson in institutional resilience. The throne was bigger than the man who sat on it.